MOTU, Masters of the Universe. I'm a huge fan. Huge. If you couldn't tell from the Masters of the Universe Origins line behind me. I loved them then, I collect them now. But that doesn't mean I didn't think a few of those originals weren't a bit ridiculous. I'm Victor, and straight out of the Gen Experience, the original Masters of the Universe, and some of the silliest characters to come from that toy line. He-Man and Skeletor arrived to me on Christmas in 1981. Yes, 1981. With no information but the mini comic to guide me, I was hooked. They are today still my most treasured of favorite franchises made famous in the 1980s. I never got to collect them all, until now of course. But even then, when struggling to up my MOTU action figure numbers, there were more winners than losers to be certain. But here are my 10 MOTU toys I would have hung back on their peg or put back on the shelf. Remember, these are my 10, not yours. I wonder how much hate I'll get right off the bat, but can we just agree that Faker wasn't fooling anybody? Honestly, I never liked him. The cartoon got it right though. Besides some glowing eyes, the evil robot of Skeletor was not far off from our legendary hero in the show. As for the toy, if Skeletor's armor wasn't a clue, you'd have to be legally blind not to notice the blue skin and the orange hair on this character. Lest we also forget the old school reel-to-reel magnetic tape data port on his chest that was almost obsolete in 1983. I get it, Mattel wanted another figure but needed to minimize cost, so a repaint of He-Man with existing armor would suffice. But it's this, alongside the tongue-in-cheek naming convention Faker, that makes this have no wow factor. I don't know how kids played with Faker back then, as the other characters would have to be under the influence to mistake this guy for the most powerful man in the universe. But wait, there's more. This is not the most absurd. Speaking of Skeletor, we just were, let's introduce the first variant that made me go, huh? Initially, I was going to drop Dragon Blast Skeletor on the list. Dragon Blast was basically old Skelly with Cobra Khan chained to his back to spray his enemies with acid. No, poison. No, sleeping gas. No, whatever. Actually, the idea of chaining Cobra Khan to Skeletor isn't a bad idea. I loved Cobra Khan's feature, and the name is pretty cool too. But no, I chose Terror Claw's Skeletor. The evil Lord of Destruction is a frightening warrior with magical powers, and here he chooses to wear long talon-like monster hands to swipe menacingly at his victims, flailing at them to stay away. There was no magic in them their 80s half-top. That their crop top, that their sports bra. A bad idea, and the one who came up with it should have been demoted to the mailroom. The Terror Claws variant continues to be made through various lines today. It must be popular, and yet I don't think many would miss it if this Skeletor got a manicure. This might make some of you crazy, but relax, you can make your own list. Of course, I have them in my Origins collection. I have all the originals they have released so far. But damn it, they need to get that Real Blast out ASAP. Now back to the one that's going to cause the stink. Stinkor. He smelled bad, and that's good. That was the marketing push and the reason he was so attractive to add to the ranks of our evil warriors. Stinkor, the basic I am called what I do naming convention, is absurd. But this guy, he's absurd, so it works. But you can't deny he's fun. Look, the package says so. Like is often in most toy lines, a repaint of existing pieces and parts made for an inexpensive new character, and one that has stood the test of time. Stinkor is absurd in so many ways, and although he did not make it into the original Filmation series, his figure was so attractive to the 80s kids and the gross-out trends of boys' toys in the time. He was a repaint to the original Merman, who looked nothing like we were promised, but that's a whole other story. It was the patchouli oil infused in his plastic when pouring the mold that gave off the foul and yet musky smell many love, including me. What a gimmick, what a quote-unquote power for one of Skeletor's warriors. The problem is, it didn't last. As a toy, you used him to stop the good guys in their tracks with his overpowering odor of evil. But a couple of months later, Stinkor was an overgrown skunk with a shield. Yeah, just a shield. And he's going to need it because without his vile aroma in battle, the masters are going to pulverize him. Without his smell, he's a grunt, a monster with a menacing face, and he moves to the back of the ranks. We had Mossman before Stinkor, a redesign of the original Beastman, and alongside his fresh pine sol, his forest fragrance, The unique touch of his flocking supported his Lord of Nature identity, his control of woodland creatures' persona, and his master of camouflage characterization. Long after his car air freshener scent had faded, Mossman was still in battle, while Stinkor was roadkill. Skeletor already got the variant treatment, so it's our favorite big blonde hunk's turn. He-Man already had a power punch. Well, they all did. It wasn't anything special. Until you load He-Man's new backpack with a strip of caps. I'm assuming everyone watching knows what caps are, but for those who may not, they're a mixture of potassium perchlorate, sulfur, and antimony sulfide sandwiched between two paper layers that hold in the gases long enough to give an audible sound when the cap is struck, usually by a toy six-shooter. In this case, a mechanism that would fire the cap inside the backpack when the figure was turned. I wouldn't say it sounded like thunder as the name implies, but I guess Snap Crackle Pop He-Man may have had some legal issues. The caps were a popular favorite kids' plaything since at least the 1950s, and even without a gun, you could get a bang and your sulfur smell fix by simply slamming the gray dot with a rock. A little spark, a tiny explosion, and we were satisfied. It took little to entertain us. But with such a lackluster effect as a snap when he punched, along with the mediocre new ensemble, Thunder Punch was too little to be bothered with by me. I bet many of you are huge fans of this one, and probably many on the list. But as I said, I don't hate these characters, I just find some more unappealing than others. But it was close. I don't know which disinterested me more, Flying Fists He-Man or Hurricane Hordak. But the spinning features on both of them beat out Thunder Punch based solely on the replacement of caps once you ran out. Oh boy, I almost like Dragstore. The action feature, a staple in toys since at least the 60s, was still fire in the 80s. Pull the cord and he speeds into battle via the Goodyear tire embedded in his chest. Bowling over his enemies or mowing them down in drag race style. No, not that drag race. He is all gimmick and there is nothing else to love. His box says, Transforming Evil Warrior Vehicle. They must have been rushing a deadline because even that descriptor byline is lame. When the character stood up, his threat level stood down. Could the heroes just pop his tire and he was down for the count until Triclops brought him a spare? His box also boasted he chased down enemies with a burst of speed. Probably for the best, considering his rotund size prevents him from running too fast or for too long. As Evil Warriors go, Dragstore was one of the last. And his look, along with the name that says, "Look, I'm called what my character does," is why he's ridiculous. Yes, Ram Man, Moss Man, and any other man descriptor name isn't all that creative, but here it's the total package. He has no substance. He is forgettable, and perhaps that's because he was towards the end of the line. But if Mattel Creations announces him tomorrow, hell yeah, I will be first in line. Don't think because he's not my top tier, he won't be appearing on my shelf. Okay, so Modulok wasn't bad. Actually, he was an inspired creation departing from the Motu norms. He'd up their game with all the parts and the configurations. Promising over 1,000 different robot combinations, many of them leaving Multibot not sure if he was coming or going, Masters of the Universe may not have been sure either. They were trying new tactics. Who didn't love that? Modulok and Multibot were Motu's first foray into some transforming action. Not quite the same from their popular contemporaries, it wouldn't be long before they went all in on the robots in disguise, with the Rock People, followed by the Meteorbs, who also brought up the rear of the toy line, as it was cancelled soon after their release. So Multibot was a cheap follow-up to Modulok. He had a look all his own, so that wasn't cheap in regard to design or the molds. However, a robot version didn't seem as interesting after the bug-like original. I suppose if you wanted what seemed like endless combinations, a kid might want both figures. But for me, after you already have Modulok, why bother? I would love to see what some kids dreamed up with all of those parts. Oh, anyone else reminded of Human Centipede? My only creature on the list, and after Panther, Zor, and Battlecat, Hordak riding into battle on his mighty praying mantis almost incites giggles. This slender and skeletal silhouette might rouse some fear, but when your counterparts are riding huge attack cats and eventually dinosaurs, your big bug just doesn't seem to cut it. I give them points for looking at other inspiration for the evil horde. Hell, King Hiss of the Snake Men didn't even get a mount. Although I like Monstroid better, that too would not have been a great choice. I felt when it came to Hordak, dragons needed to be introduced. A skeleton dragon would have been bitchin', but the Mantisaur, even with his action feature, I guess you can call it an action feature, that scoops up his prey in his long insectoid limbs, just didn't do anything for me. They could have at least made his front limbs look like Rock'em Sock'em robots or those boxing nuns. That would have been something. At least Mantisaur made it into the She-Ra cartoon. At least I think it was Mantisaur. Moving on. Okay, I did have some trouble adding this guy to the list. I like Snoutspout, and even his name is more thoughtful than most. They could have gone with the more disastrous Spoutor, but level heads prevailed. So yeah, Snoutspout is a firefighter. Not far of a stretch there, but what is a stretch is the clear and obvious pachyderm design for our heroic flame douser. It is an easy reach. A snout, spraying water, a fireman. But it also takes you out of the fantasy of a distant planet. This was Eternia, not Earth, and I was unaware that herds of elephants roamed the Valley of Gnarl. It said that Snoutspout was once a peasant, who was grafted cybernetic parts to his face. But an elephant? That would just be too much for me to bear. But after such an unfortunate incident, I'm glad he chose to do something positive with his life and fight fires. Who knows? Maybe next he'll pose for a calendar. He at least comes complete with water tanks to wear on his back, as well as an axe. Yes, the fireman's tool. However, it is that tool that makes him look a little more ridiculous, as the design of the axe was created to be a snout holder, or a hose targeting tool. You can see on the box, it's used to hold up and point his hose so as not to miss. So altogether, as cute as he might be, he does make my list for being rather ridiculous, but certainly loved. This guy. Okay, what an idea. I looked around for other action figures that had success with simply having the character blow themselves up. I had very little luck. That's right, Blast Attack. One of Skeletor's henchmen was a living hand grenade made to, well, how do I say it? Be a suicide bomber? This figure is dark. My first recollection of him, I was curious how they would design the inside of the figure that figuratively blows itself to smithereens, then puts himself back together again. It's a disturbing thought, and yes, he was painted all red. Luckily, he is an android, but with a face like that, I imagine he's very similar to Ash from Alien, without all that milky fluid when he falls apart. Blast Attack was also made at the end of the line, and I think Masters of the Universe knew it was the end of the line. Thank God he didn't appear in the cartoon, but like Dragstore, I need him to be produced in Origins so I can get him on my shelf. Number 10. The last entry is really 2 entries, and why not? Whereas I liked Stondar and Rockon, the Rock People, their disguise as boulders was a sensible gimmick, and Stondar was my last Motu action figure I ever got during the original run. Even if I was to acquire more at the time, Rotar and Twistoid would not have topped my list. They're forgettable at best, and I personally would skip them both if they still popped up in the Origins line. Unless they come with legs. You see, Rotar and Twistoid, they were both tops. I mean like spinning tops, toy tops. Realizing we had already used squirt gun tech, ripcord tech, and caps, I drew the line at tops. These guys had no bodies, and if they were meant to manifest tornadoes like X-Men Storm, Motu already had Cyclone, and he was awesome. Even with their shooting bladed discs, they came across as afterthoughts, or Mattel grasping at straws at the very end. Rotar was heroic and Twistoid evil. They had a story in the mini-comic, whereas their legs were badly damaged in battle. They were given tops for bottoms. For legs. Not bionic legs, not cybernetic legs, but tops. To dart around and spin and cause confusion on the battlefield. If I was either of them, I would be pissed. They are hardly remembered and do not get exposure. I support my decision to put them as the most ridiculous Motu action figures from the original toy line. There you have it. Anyone else have some they would put on their list? Don't hate, I love Masters of the Universe, and all of them have their place in pop culture and toy history. But I can have my favorites to cheer for, and those to jeer at. And these were my 10. Many of them have continued to pop up in new incarnations of the franchise, and that is evidence of their fan base. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found this both interesting and entertaining. If so, please consider subscribing, and of course click the like. Even if you didn't enjoy it, I'm so happy you dropped by. Please watch other great shows direct from the Gen Experience. Thanks for watching, and until next time.
Like I said, no problem.